and East Germany in urban apartments with little space for living, much less procreating. Contemporary German social stability is predicated upon a generous, ironclad, cradle-to-grave system of government services. Germany has been able to afford it because of a triple quirk in its demographic structure. Both East and West Germany enjoyed a brief baby boom between 1955 and 1965. That generation has been working and paying taxes for decades, and in the 2010s is at the height of its earning and tax-paying years. Germany's boomers didn't have many children, circumscribing expenses for services like primary education and childcare. The state instead directs the savings into value-added items, like higher education and infrastructure. Some 8 million Germans died in the world wars, gutting populations that would have been retirees in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. High tax receipts plus few dependents equals excellent government finances. But this golden age of high tax receipts and low government payouts is ending. With the exception of the Lebensraum, German reproductive rates have been edging down for 16 decades and are now far past terminal. The nearly childless German baby boomer generation enters mass retirement in the 2020s, cursing contemporary Germany with a collapse in productive capacity, a collapse in tax receipts, a collapse in consumption, and an explosion of state outlays for pensions and health care. As soon as 2030, the young generation entering the workforce will be less than half the size of the boomer generation retiring. In any normal country, this would spell economic and social failure. Such ruin assumes that economic trends in Germany are positive. The quest for efficiency and quality, so central to German identity, comes at a cost. All those local and regional German governments try to capture private savings to fund community goals, leaving little in the way of financial resources for the development of a consumption-centric culture. Pair high production with low consumption, and the only option is to export the difference. Late 1800s Imperial Germany was able to absorb its output because then, like 1990s China, Germany was industrializing. But by 1900, over half the population had moved off the farm, making it the world's first majority urbanized country. An achievement, yes, but there was nowhere else for its production to go, except abroad. The mix of overproduction and subsequent imperial trade barriers ensured a litany of recessions, price crashes, and general economic dislocation. European interstate competition, already political, became deeply economic as well. It was only a matter of time until it became strategic. The first of those strategic competitions, World War I, ended with German defeat and kicked off the Great Depression, which struck nowhere worse than where it started, in Germany. Americana tells tales of Depression-era city folk returning to the farms to work the land during the Depression's deepest years. Not so in Germany, where the majority of Germans had been living in cities for decades. The only thing the Germans could do to keep costs down was to not have children. Germany's post-Cold War unification was a phenomenal national achievement, but that doesn't mean there were no side effects. The new national government decreed that the value of the former West and East German currencies would be broadly equalized, despite the East's far less advanced industrial plans. The valuation decision aimed to preserve the personal savings of the former East Germans, a political necessity in savings-driven Germany, but it has gutted the competitiveness of the East German economy ever since. Not only did this haunt the Germans with echoes of the sort of dislocation and unemployment they experienced during the Great Depression, but family formation, and from it, birth rates in the former East, crashed and never recovered. There is never a good time to have a terminal demography, but contemporary European economic trends argue for now being among the worst. A rapidly shrinking working-age population, paying a higher tax rate to support an ever larger retiree population, means Germany's already weak ability to absorb its own production weakens further. It is more important than ever for the Germans to have a place to send their wares. Germany's biggest exports by value are automotive, with 80% of the cars Germans manufacture at home being sold outside of Germany. The European Union is no longer that place. While few countries have as poor a demographic structure as Germany, most of those in the running are also within the European Union. The rest of Europe has aged beyond being able to serve Germany as an export sink. Europe isn't economically capable of filling that role, even if its demographics were healthy. At least some portion of the continent has been in recession at any given time between 2007 and 2020. Because the Germans provided the largest chunk of the financial assistance required to bail out the EU's failing members, but Berlin conditioned that support on budget cuts. Europe's weaker countries are Europe's weaker countries because they lack Germany's sublime economic geography. The state spending of these weaker states is part of what helped those weaker states close the gap with the Germans. German-imposed austerity gutted growth potential, and from it, Europe's capacity to absorb German products. Northern Europe, with all its flats and seas, is a rough-and-tumble region, with everyone in everyone else's face all the time. Germans, right in the middle of it all, have little choice but to treat military issues the same way they treat everything else, by being better. Germany's very strength invites panicked challenge. The rise and fall of Germany is European history. The only way the Europeans have ever discovered to prevent this never-ending cycle of wars is to change the game, to bring in an external security guarantor who forces everyone to be on the same side. In Europe, the institution that operationalizes the American-led order is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO alliance shoehorned all European militaries, Germany included, into a single command and logistical structure under American strategic and operational authority. NATO's twin goals were to force an internal Western European peace while also securing Western Europe against Soviet aggression. As Hastings Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, so famously put it, the alliance's raison d'etre was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. With the Cold War's end, Germany entered the best of all possible worlds. NATO expanded into the former Soviet Empire, surrounding Germany with allies. Germany's military ceased being relevant, largely because it ceased existing. Repeated, past-the-bone budget gougings functionally eliminated all German air, naval, and armored deployment capacity. For all intents and purposes, Germany no longer has a military. From 1990 until 2020, this has been fine. After all, Germany didn't face major security threats. And so the spotlight shifted from NATO to the parallel European institution formed by the Europeans themselves, the European Union. Unlike NATO, which benefits from a very large and in-charge leader and a crystal-clear founding goal, the EU tends to muddle through. Is it an economic union? A financial union? A political union? A counterweight to the United States? A free trade zone? As of early 2020, the EU has 27 members. The British left the EU in 2019, and if you ask the EU's collective leadership any of these questions, you will get at least a half-dozen different answers. And that's before getting down to the nitty-gritty details of bank bailouts, or debt levels, or negotiating authority, or political norms, or voting parameters. Even relatively mild disputes require the heads of state hashing out the details during multiple all-night summits. The really big issues, such as how to address a sovereign debt crisis or undocumented migration, occupy all leadership bandwidth for a decade or more. There's also the not-so-minor issue of who's in charge. Formally, the EU presidency rotates among all the members for 6-month terms. Under the order, this slowly, softly, oddly ambling path to integration was fine. The Americans did all the heavy lifting on the security front via NATO, on the global front via their Navy, on the energy front via their position in the Persian Gulf, on the raw materials front via their primacy in the Western Hemisphere and their alliance with Australia, and on the trade front via the World Trade Organization, as well as keeping all of Europe lined up on the same side. Europe could afford to have knockdown, drag-out, multi-day arguments with itself over cheese policy. That's not a joke. For the Germans, all this dysfunction is part of contemporary Europe's beauty. NATO bars security competition among the European powers. No matter how messy or awkward or myopic the EU might become, keeping the field of competition purely economic enables Germany to be physically intact and industrially dynamic. For Berlin, that's what matters. That's all that matters. With wealth rising, stability assured, and the Germans quiescent, many Europeans have come to believe in a heady dream that after centuries of living in the world's most blood-soaked lands, they had finally achieved a sort of historical escape velocity. It's a beautiful dream. I want to believe it too. But with the American abdication of responsibility, that dream dies. Europe is a region of military pygmies who face pressing military challenges. A region suffering demographic implosion, unable to absorb immigrants. A region peppered with xenophobes who cannot control their borders. A region rumbling with environmentalists who cannot generate green power. A region facing a banking crisis that lacks the means of even defining the problem, much less rectifying it. A region that has largely outsourced its relationships with its nearest neighbors of significance, Turkey and Russia, to the departing Americans. A region whose most coherent economic, financial, and military power, the United Kingdom, has left. Europe now faces simultaneous, interlocking crises: currency, finance, banking, monetary policy, supply chains, inequality, migration, oil, natural gas, electricity, demographics, consumption, exports, imports, Libya, Syria, Turkey, Russia. Any response requires that all European states agree on how to prioritize and address each problem. Which means for the Germans, the worst of all worlds is about to arrive. Germany is not a sunny or windy country. Despite spending nearly €2 trillion on alternate energy infrastructure and setting up omnipresent regulatory structures to favor the green tech sector, which have doubled power prices from 2000 levels, which were already more than double average U.S. prices, Germany receives less than 10% of its electricity needs from green power. Germany is more dependent upon fuel imports now than before it started its green surge. Half of Germany's exports and all its energy imports rely on access to countries beyond the EU. The United States is Germany's largest end market, while China ranks third. Nearly all of Germany's manufacturing supply chains rely upon access to countries within the EU. Germany's and Europe's demographic collapse deepens both the consumption and the production problems. With the Americans' departure, security competition is back on the table. As in China, German economic growth has been nothing shy of fantastic. As in China, German economic growth has been possible only due to the changed local security environment and risk-free trade links to the wider world that the order provided. Like China, Germany will suffer hugely from the order's end. Germany is now returning to the same rise and fall cycle that has so defined its history. The Germans are left with starkly limited choices. The North Sea has oil and natural gas, but other countries in the sea's basin, most notably the United Kingdom, already absorb most of what is available via pre-existing infrastructure. The sea's resources are unavailable to Germany. The Middle East has plenty to go around, but that region is on the wrong side of the European continent and Turkey. In a world of unsafe shipping lanes, Germany might as well be on another planet. Labor options are similarly limited. Within Europe, the Scandinavians, British, and French all operate at similar cost structures, so there are few options for operational synergies. Many European countries keep most of their manufacturing supply chains in-house for reasons geographic: the United Kingdom, Sweden, or mercantile, France, Spain. Sometimes it is simply an issue of style. Italy operates differently. Instead of the German approach of assembly lines and mass production, the Italians treat industry more like art, one at a time, handmade outputs. When the Italians handcraft a car, it's a Ferrari. When they mass produce, it's a Fiat. The largest consumption bases locally are the French and British. Even at the height of the order, the French like to keep their market to themselves. The United Kingdom was more open, but in the aftermath of the Brexit drama, count on access to the British market flat out ending. The Dutch will continue to do business with Germany, but the Netherlands is more a flow-through economy than a large final destination. The 17 million Dutch can absorb only so much. But looking east, the Germans see opportunity. The former Soviet satellites of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary are not only near, but geographic barriers between them and the Germans are minimal. If long-haul energy imports are not an option, Russia is brimming with, relatively, short-haul delivery options, much of which flows via pipes that are already in place. Labor costs in the Central European states are 1/3 or even less of those in Germany. Integrating manufacturing systems with them not only makes economic sense, but also provides economies of scale the Germans could never achieve on their own. Poland and its Central European cohorts may be only about one-half as wealthy as Germany, but there are nearly as many people in those countries as there are Germans in Germany. They provide both manufacturing labor and a consumption base. Just beyond the Central European zone are 44 million Ukrainians and 140-ish million Russians who have proven unable to meet their own manufacture needs in any era. What's left that is worth having fits Germany's needs, and yet remains within reach isn't to the west, but to the east, putting the Germans and the Russians on a collision course. German success puts an integrated German manufacturing system in territory directly adjacent to lands the Russians see as their critical security zone. No more buffer zone. In a post-order world, everyone starts to get agitated again, with German manufacturing becoming a bit less Volkswagen-y and a bit more Panzer-y. And since the Germans will be rearming from a nearly disarmed start, the pace of defense improvement will prove terrifying to anyone who has ever crossed swords, bayonets, or artillery with the Germans in the past. On the flip side, Russian success puts Russian occupational forces within a 4-hour drive of Berlin on a light traffic day. So, where does that take us? One last dance. Germany's core issues of materials and export access are not new. Neither are Russia's concerns with frontiers and internal rebellions. Nor is it the first time the two countries have found themselves in a mutually antagonistic overlap. Historically, when such things happen, the leaders of both countries tend to take deep breaths and have a thorough conversation about the lands between them. They then proceed to draw lines around topics and on maps with the intention of avoiding a bloodbath. The problem is always the same. Divvying up influence over the territories between them is the easy part. Once any agreement is executed, however, the buffer zone between them vanishes, swallowed up by the two powers. Direct borders mean direct competitions. Every time the Germans and Russians reach this point, they eventually end up shooting at each other. The only question is, how long does the honeymoon last? A generation? A decade? Less? The last time the pact held for only 22 months. This time around, 4 issues argue for, at most, a brief period of coexistence. First, military technologies are evolving again. The last Russo-German war started with artillery and planes. Now there are cruise missiles and jets. As a rule, increases in speed and reach and lethality compress timeframes. Second, change is not simply coming to Germany and Russia's neighborhoods, but to Germany and Russia themselves. Surviving the coming global breakdown will spawn political, social, and economic revolutions in both countries. The last time these two peoples experienced such rapidly shifting fortunes, the results included Nazism and Leninism. The point is less that we'll see a return to fascism in Germany and fascism with a different name in Russia, but instead that the pressures that generated the last, harshly negative government overhaul in both countries are very similar to those of today. For example, consider what drove the fascist rise during the Weimar period of 1930s Germany. Massive dislocation of labor due to new industrial techniques that limited the need for manpower, massive economic dislocations due to disrupted export markets, massive economic inequality, massive population and migration imbalances, and political leaders who weren't so much tone-deaf as trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The Weimar system ultimately found itself overthrown by populists, who were far from shy about lurching Germany in a dangerous new direction. Any of that sound familiar? If the Americans are not managing Europe and seeing to the continent's economic and security needs, then Germany must act like a normal country again. Whatever form the Fifth Reich takes, it cannot possibly be as pacifist and deferential as the Fourth. For Russia, the possibility of a sharp systematic turnover looms even larger. Fewer than 200 people remain in Russia's intelligence officials-dominated political elite. Russia is now firmly in the zone where a single plane crash or assassination campaign or bad flu season could trigger a government breakdown or coup. The third argument for a quick slide into confrontation has to do with the limited time remaining for the countries themselves. Both countries suffer from demographic weakness so extreme as to be a country-killing issue all by itself. The time horizon is so short that most Germans and Russians alive today will live to see the end. That end might come sooner than even the country's abysmal demographic profile suggests, because not all revolutions succeed. When a political, economic, or cultural system experiences violent overhaul, there is typically a multi-year period of reset, while the old system is being wiped away, but the new system hasn't fully replaced it. The last time that happened in Germany, it involved the World War II defeat. The last time for Russia, the post-Cold War breakdown. In each case, simply finding the floor took at least half a decade. A failed political, social, and economic transformation now would likely gobble up so much of what little time Germany or Russia have remaining that they never recover. And that's before one considers the bilateral competition. What might a successful Russia do to take advantage of a failed Germany, or vice versa? A German failure to secure an economic orbit, or a Russian failure to secure better borders, really does mean the end this time around. The all-or-nothing nature of this competition intensifies pressures, raises stakes, and, again, compresses timeframes. Both countries are quite literally raging against the dying of the light. Which brings us to the fourth and final reason this is a struggle unlikely to end in a calm co-dominion over Central and Eastern Europe. Germany and Russia are not the only fish in the pond. At the top of the list of states of concern must be the United States. It isn't that the Americans are likely to see anything that overly bothers them in the intensifying German-Russian collaboration confrontation directly, but instead that actions by either Berlin or Moscow may inadvertently rub Washington the wrong way and prompt American action. A world in which American interests in Europe are not grounded in NATO, and the order is one in which American involvement is far more likely to be corporate. Because Germany's primary motivation is to secure an economic sphere of influence, the Americans and Germans could well find themselves tangling over this or that market or resource flow. A failure in Berlin to manage such entanglement effectively could sever what few connections to the wider world Germany would have otherwise managed to maintain. The Americans can easily operate beyond Europe, while Germany cannot at all. A falling out between Washington and Moscow would likely have a more visceral outcome. The United States defense and intelligence community has decades of experience in countering all things Russian. That experience, and the information and weapon systems that go with it, can easily be shared with countries or ethnic groups that could do Russia irreparable harm. British intervention is less of an if and more of a how. For the better part of the past 3 centuries, the United Kingdom, and the British Empire before it, was involved in over a dozen wars and near-war competitions with both the Germans and Russians, sometimes at the same time. In part, it was because London is an inveterate sea power, while Germany and Russia are land powers. In part, it was because at the height of the empire, the British were sort of fighting with everyone. But in the years to come, British motivation will follow 2 themes. First, it's simply good strategy. British policy since the beginning has been to prevent the formation of a European navy that can threaten Great Britain. The easiest way to achieve that goal is to take preventative measures so no single power can rule all of continental Europe. A fully united Europe would be a peer, not with Britain, but with the United States, and the navy it could float would be able to sweep the British from the seas. Taking preemptive action to prevent the rise of a European hegemon is as central to British identity as a gin and tonic and sturdy rain gear. The 2 countries that have come closest to dominating Europe since 1850 are Germany and Russia. For London, the possibility of Germany and Russia disappearing from Europe forever is too tantalizing a possibility to do anything but encourage. Second, there will definitely be a revenge play. When it comes to Russia, the same Russian cyber tools that have so inflamed American politics have been used the same way in the United Kingdom on both sides of the Scottish independence issue, the Brexit issue, and the rise and fall of both the Conservatives and the Labourites. The Brits would love for that sort of shit to stop, for good. Against Germany, British motivations are more instinctive. There is a powerful strand of thinking among the English that the Germans should have been more understanding of the British divorce from the European Union. While at the same time of this writing, the Brexit drama remains a work in progress. It is already messy, and the British economy is facing a multi-year depression. Yet Britain is an experienced sea power that can apply diplomatic, economic, financial, and military pressure nearly anywhere it wants without fear of reprisal. And it has centuries of experience applying that pressure to Europe. Payback's a bitch. Next comes a family of nations, the Scandinavians. The region's mix of geographies is eclectic in the extreme. Norway is in effect a city-state with a ridiculously long ocean frontage. Finland lost its best territory to the Soviets in World War II, and at times has resembled an armed camp. Denmark is an island nation with an almost British worldview. The Balts were Soviet-occupied. Sweden has fought wars with pretty much everyone in the region on multiple occasions. With the Americans gone, no one will stand up for them, save one another. Courtesy of the exploits of Danish and Swedish Vikings, all are quite literally family. None will exactly be enthused about German activism, but ultimately it is Russia that keeps Scandinavian leaders up at night. The only way the Russians can truly be secure is if the Baltic trio once again becomes subordinate to Moscow. That alone will prove sufficient to make the Scandinavians close ranks, and maybe even lead them to cheer the Germans on, through clenched teeth. Finally, there is one power in particular that will perceive any iteration of a German-Russian love fest as nothing short of horrifying: Poland. Poland has warred with the Germans and Russians more than any other European nation, and on 2 occasions was divvied up and devoured by its 2 larger neighbors. In a straight-up fight, the Poles don't stand a chance. Their population is half that of Germany, and their level of economic development is not all that much better than Russia's. They lack the demographic, economic, or technical prowess to go toe-to-toe with either Germany or Russia, much less Germany and Russia. But 3 points come to mind. First, unlike the World War II carve-up, this time around the Poles are industrialized. They'd still lose, but they'd certainly put up a bigger fight than the 3 weeks it took the Soviets and Germans to snuff them out in 1939. Second, they'd get loads of help. Anything that keeps the Germans and Russians focused on another land power is one that takes the pressure off the more maritime British and Scandinavians. In the end, the maritime powers, with their more diversified economies, easier supply lines, better demographics, and superior strategic insulation, really just need to play for time. Poland can buy some for them, but only if it doesn't get steamrolled. Expect to see extensive naval, air force, logistics, materiel, intelligence, and completely disavowable special forces assistance. Third, nuclear weapons could very well enter the mix. In the order, countries have typically sought nuclear weapons to deter countries they feared might prove unbeatable in a conventional war. Israel against the Arab powers, Pakistan against India, North Korea and Iran against the United States. But remove the Americans from the mix, and the list of countries that might find a nuclear deterrent useful changes and expands. Japan and Taiwan against China. South Korea against North Korea and Japan. Saudi Arabia against Iran. Finland, Sweden, Germany, and especially Poland against Russia. There isn't anything secret about how to make an atomic weapon. The technologies involved have existed since the 1940s. Back then, the Americans did it start to finish in about 4 years at a budget of less than $25 billion in today's dollars, with some 90% of that budget going toward the production of fissile material available today as waste product from every existing nuclear power plant. Nukes, especially if the intent is to lob it at your next-door neighbor rather than sling it around the planet, are not hard. And if the Germans and Russians come sniffing around Central Europe after the Americans go home, no one needs nukes more than the Poles. A nuclear-infused stalemate among Germany, Poland, and Russia would hamstring Germany's economic plans as well as Russia's security expansion, while also ensuring Poland's survival, all without a shot being fired. That might make it the best of all worlds for everyone, save Germany and Russia. Which means that any serious Polish effort to develop a deterrent would likely be met by exactly the sort of assault the Poles would be hoping to forestall. Can Germany and Russia survive their challenges in this sort of degraded economic and security environment, even if they can somehow avoid coming to blows? The honest answer is probably not. Neither country has enough staying power to make it through this competition, and there are too many countries capable and close that have a vested interest in their mutual failure. What is certain is, whether it takes the form of collaboration or confrontation on any given day, in their death throes, Berlin and Moscow will only have eyes for each other, and those unfortunate enough to be caught in the line of their gaze.
Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from a very foggy Colorado. It is the 16th of February, and the news today is that Russian prison authorities have announced the death of Alexei Navalny, who was a political prisoner who had the audacity to criticize Vladimir Putin had run for office long ago, years ago, and has been in prison ever since. He was transferred about a year ago to a high-security prison in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. It was an old Soviet gulag. This is basically where the Russian government sends people when they want them to die because it's cold, it's brutal, there's no heat, and medical service is deliberately denied. So the idea that he's dead is not exactly a shock. The Russian government very well could have actually executed him, and no one would know. Now, back in 2021, the Biden administration said the death of Navalny would trigger a collapse in international relations that would really punish the Russians. But since then, the Russians have launched a war and killed a couple 100,000 people in Ukraine. So pretty much all of the stops that could be pulled out have been pulled out. And about the only way to punish the Russians now would be to send a lot more weapons to Ukraine or to do an outright block of all of their energy exports, neither of which on the moment, for a mix of political and economic reasons, are on deck. So I don't want to say anything weird like, the Russians are going to get away with this because there's a lot going on, but don't expect any sort of tactical response from the Americans in general or the West. Now, before anyone gets too crying about this, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, Russia's not a democracy. It hasn't really been a democracy in over 20 years. So even if Navalny was allowed to continue to be part of the political conversation in Russia, it's not like he has any chance of changing policy. He was more of a personal annoyance to Putin and nothing more. There are other people within the ruling party who have decided to run for presidency against Putin on a very nationalist ticket, but just be opposed to the war, and they're not being allowed to participate either. So it really doesn't matter. It's something that pro-democracy activists in the West get really excited about because he's a name that more people know, but he was never going to have any influence. Second, careful what you wish for. Navalny may have been a nicer guy than Putin because, low bar, but he was just as nationalist. And his biggest criticism of the Ukraine war wasn't that it was happening, but it just wasn't being prosecuted very well. People forget that the strong predilection among Russians is to continue the war. They just don't want to be part of it personally. The idea that Russia needs to expand its borders in order to survive is not one that is particularly debated in Russia. It's generally been their security policy for 400 years, that as long as your external borders are flat and open, you're not safe. So you have to go through Ukraine to get to Romania and Poland and the rest. Now, of course, that's bad for Romania and Poland and the rest, but the Russians are not misreading the map. And unfortunately, that gets wrapped up in the political discussion so that folks like Navalny appear more important than they really are. So, I feel bad for the guy and his family, but we were probably always going to get here. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Doubtful Sound, and in this next in our series of regional geopolitics in a post-American world, I want to talk about Northern Europe, specifically the Scandinavian region. Now, this is an area that has been fractured by history. You've got islands, you've got peninsulas, you've got de facto city-states, but while they have been powerful in the past, they've kind of been sleeping for the last 300 years. And during the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, it's been fractured into a number of different governments. But I think the best way to think about this is not so much a collection of countries, but a family of Vikings who are getting to know each other again. The original Vikings were the Danes and the Swedes, who basically went off, raided and pillaged, and founded little trading depots everywhere that they went, and some of those depots eventually rose to become significant countries in themselves. Think of Riga in Latvia, or Oslo in Norway, or Reykjavik in Iceland. But by the time we get to the modern era, they had been broken into different spheres of influence. In the post-Cold War environment, however, especially now with the Ukraine war happening, we're seeing a changing of fortunes as these countries are rediscovering each other. And we're already in an environment where a lot of them consider themselves so familial that they already have a lot of joint embassies around the world. But if there's one thing they're all concerned about, it's Russia. Denmark is the last country approaching the Baltic Sea, so that if the Russians ever make a bid to get in the open ocean, they go by them. The Norwegians control the northern coastline, so they know the North Point is something they're responsible for. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania used to be Russian colonies under the Soviet period, and Sweden is a mid-sized power that was ultimately smashed by Russian power 3 centuries ago. and only recently has kind of emerged, whereas Finland was both a Swedish territory and a Russian territory based on which time frame you're looking at, and only really became independent in a traditional sense in the last decade or so as it's broken away from its Finlandization programs, which were basically a way that the Soviets used to crush Finns' strategic autonomy. What we're seeing now is this whole cluster of countries coming back together all on the same side of the same geopolitical orientation, no longer fractured by other powers, with Sweden absolutely being the center weight of all of it. It's probably best to think of most of these countries not so much as countries, but as cities that just happen to own another swath of territory. So in the case of, say, Riga or Copenhagen or Oslo, over half, in fact, almost 3/4 of the population is in that one city, and the rest of the territory just kind of hangs on. Sweden is the exception. I mean, yes, Stockholm is by far the largest, but it actually has a populated zone in the south that is agricultural. There are a number of cities going up and down the Baltic Sea coast. And so it is arguably as powerful, if not more powerful, than all of the others put together. And now that Sweden is emerging from its traditional neutrality and starting to write its own security policies, it is going to be a major force to be reckoned with. A couple things about this region to keep in mind. Number one, it is very, very naval. Because of the Baltic Sea, because of the Gulf of Bothnia, this is a zone that if they're going to survive, they have to do so in the context of having a powerful navy to keep potential rivals at bay. And that means, number two, it's actually fairly easy for them to partner with other powers from out of region, assuming for the moment that those other powers are also naval. Because if they were to partner with, say, the French or the Germans, who are primarily land powers, these countries would see themselves overwhelmed. They're just not big enough. Sweden doesn't even have 10 million people versus, say, France is roughly 60. The whole region put together can't add up to a France, much less a Germany. But if you bring in the United Kingdom, you've got a very different sort of power dynamic. And the United Kingdom, like the Swedes, like the Danes, like the Estonians, really doesn't want to see a single large mega power emerge in the Eurasian or the European space, because that would be a threat to their naval independence. And so the Brits have always gotten along spectacularly with all of the Scandinavians, and now that the Swedes and the Finns are ditching neutrality, the partnership between London and these places is very strong. To a lesser degree, the United States is in the same place. Now, the United States overall is looking to slim down its security commitments moving forward, but it doesn't take a lot of cooperation between the Americans and, say, the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians in order to achieve some outside outcomes, because all of the Scandinavians just want to maintain independence, which means they're always going to be, to a degree, hostile to anything that happens in Moscow and, to a lesser degree, continental Europe. That means for a very small price, the United States can really achieve some outsized outcomes working through some very reputable partners. So we should start to think of the relationship between the Americans and the Baltics and the Norwegians and the Scandinavians, however you want to define the cluster, as very similar to the American relationship with Australia. A powerful, creative ally that punches above its weight, that's going to do its own thing for its own reason, but which dovetails with American power moving forward. All right, that's it for me. Catch you guys next time.
Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from home, and I have received, no surprise here, lots and lots of questions about Tucker Carlson's interview with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin. There's really no point in going to the substance of Tucker's interview. A couple things to keep in mind about Tucker Carlson. Number one, he's been fired from every journalistic job that he has ever had for making things up. And his legal defense when he was working at Fox in recent years was that he's not a journalist at all. So he's not responsible for any sort of fact-based reporting. In fact, he literally called himself a propagandist. Which, I guess if you're going to go for a legal defense, being truthful helps. And he's been a Russian shill for several years. So the idea that he was being a Russian shill in Russia doesn't really shock me. And it was just an example of how Putin can get his message out in front of a relatively favorable audience in the United States to stir the political pot and keep the United States unable to make a broad-based response to anything that the Russians are doing. And this is not a new program. The Russians have been doing this ever since they formed the bot farm over a decade ago. More importantly is the strategic picture that we have in the Russian space right now. The Ukraine war is not at a stalemate. It hasn't been for any part of this war. We've been seeing new tactics and new weapon systems moving. The current iteration is the Russians are combining their meat assaults, as they've been called, with a much better level of coordination with other tactics, especially with artillery. One of the things to keep in mind about the Ukraine war is that we've got two very different approaches. On the Ukrainian side, authority has been devolved down to almost the unit level. But when you disassociate your military strategy to that level, yes, you'll get a lot of creative people who are doing creative things that are very effective. But the information and the successes that they have, the techniques don't necessarily percolate back up to the top, which means it's hard for the folks at the top to then apply those tactics across the entire front. So you get very, very effective commanders, but you don't necessarily get a very, very effective army. Russia has the opposite approach in that there's very little authority at the local level. And so they often have the Ukrainians running circles around them. But whenever a lesson does percolate up to the top, it is then imposed on everyone. And for the first couple of years of the war, this has definitely been working for the Ukrainians' favor, but as the Russians incrementally incorporate lessons, it's now starting to favor the Russians. And the only way that you can kind of make the Ukrainians come up again, two things. Number one, you can get them better at a little bit of command and control. And then second, of course, they need better and better weapons in order to counter what is becoming an incrementally more effective Russian war machine. That, of course, is wrapped up with politics in the Western countries, especially the United States, which is one of the many, many, many reasons that Putin arranged for his shill to come and interview him in order to keep stirring the pot so the United States would have more and more problems when it comes to acting. Just as important, arguably more important, is the Russians are thrilled about what's going on with Israel and Gaza and Iran, because every little bit of attention that the Americans give to the Israeli situation or the Gaza situation or the attacks on maritime shipping in the Red Sea is an attention that they can't give to the Ukraine war. One of the things that people forget about the American foreign policy establishment, it really has a hard time dealing with more than one issue at a time. And so for the first 16, 18 months of the Ukraine war, that was the only issue in international affairs that was in front of Joe Biden. You could argue that things with China were up there, but that was mostly in the area of economic nationalism, and that is something that can be handed off to non-foreign policy personnel. But in the United States, there's really only three people who are responsible for almost all American foreign policy. The president, obviously, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and that's usually focused on economic issues for obvious reasons, and the national security advisor. Even the Secretary of State really doesn't deal with foreign affairs. It's more of a dispensation rather than a policy creation sort of issue. And so when you only have three people, and one of them obviously has other things on his plate at any given time, and one of them is only responsible for financial and economic issues, it's really hard to get this mammoth institution of the United States focused on more than one thing at the same time. And if Israel and Gaza and Iran are absorbing more and more and more of that attention, then by default, there's less attention that can be paid to things going on in the Russian sphere. So the Russians have, from the fourth quarter of last year on, discovered that they have a lot more wiggle room because the leadership out of the United States is simply lacking. It's not that we've had a policy change in Washington. It's just that there's only so much bandwidth. And of course, now we're in an election year, and that snarls things even more. So ignore Tucker. You should have been ignoring Tucker for years, but do watch Moscow because they're finding new and more creative ways, not simply to prosecute the war at home, but to muddle the picture on a broader global scale to play into this fact that the Americans have a hard time focusing on more than one thing.